He fell, Clarissa Pendle said flatly, folding her manicured hands on the HOA board table. That's what the witnesses saw. Your son tripped over the curb. My fingers tightened around the corner of the folder I hadn't opened yet. I could hear the fluorescent light above us buzz like it wanted to interrupt her lie. Clarissa Pendle, president of the Highmere Crest HOA, didn't blink. She leaned back in her chair like she'd already won, like the room itself bent to her posture. The rest of the board, 3 men in pastel shirts and khakis, stayed quiet. I slid the folder across the table, opened it with one hand, and turned it toward them. This is a clavicle fracture. Impact from above, compressive force. Right side. I tapped the X-ray. Your version of events doesn't match this injury. Pause. Not unless the sidewalk threw a punch. If you're a parent, if you've ever had to sit in a room while someone rewrote your child's pain into fiction, you already know why I'm telling this story. Subscribe now before this escalates, because it will. And when it does, you'll want to know what power actually looks like in a place like this. My name is Elian Carr. I'm a forensic injury biomechanics specialist. I design courtroom exhibits for traumatic injury trials. Exact angles, force trajectories, anatomical diagrams, verified with radiology. I've testified in 15 states. I don't bluff. And yet, I live in a gated suburb where a woman like Clarissa Pendle can smile while gaslighting a father in front of his bleeding son's MRI. That boy, Nico, he's not loud. He doesn't argue. He sketches. He builds things out of cardboard. He has a nonverbal learning disorder and reads expressions like sheet music. He was sitting outside the east parking lot, sketching the mural wall when her son, Joran, walked up and punched him off the bench. 3 blows. 2 witnesses saw. Neither of them have spoken. But I knew something they didn't. That mosaic wall, where it happened, was designed by Nico's mother. My wife. She died 6 years ago. That wall was the last project she finished before the cancer. She embedded her initials into one of the lower tiles. Nico didn't even know. Not consciously. He just liked sitting there. That's what made this personal. That's what made me dangerous to them. They thought I'd take the warning letter and fade away. They thought they could reframe my son's trauma with HOA template language. Loitering violation, unsanctioned behavior, parental escalation. They didn't know what I do for a living. They didn't know I'd taken that X-ray to a trauma imaging lab myself, that I'd isolated the cortical fracture pattern and identified the bruise shadow as force from a downward strike, one that had to come from someone standing, not falling. They didn't know I'd tracked Nico's smartwatch data and synced it with a stress spike at 3:42 p.m. They didn't know I'd already built a 3D rendering that made their version physically impossible. But I did. And now they'd seen the first piece. Clarissa's expression barely changed. She glanced at the X-ray, then back at me. With respect, Mr. Carr, I'm not a doctor. You don't have to be, I said. You just have to stop lying. Silence. The board shifted, eyes darting between the X-ray and Clarissa's chair. I pushed my chair back slowly. Nico was waiting for me at home, ice pack wrapped, sketchbook ruined. He hadn't spoken a word since the attack. And yet here, in this climate-controlled boardroom, they were trying to fine him for disturbing the peace. The same peace he'd been drawing to honor a mother he barely remembered. I paused at the door. This doesn't end here, I said. And next time, I'm not bringing X-rays. I'm bringing what comes next. No one followed me out, but someone would. The walking trail behind the tennis courts was empty when I got there. Crushed pebbles shifted beneath my shoes with each step, the only sound breaking through the manicured silence of Highmere Crest. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the entire community knew something shameful had happened and had collectively agreed not to speak it aloud. I scanned the rows of sterile townhomes lining the back perimeter, every one of them indistinguishable from the next. Same doors, same shrubs, same window trim. A place designed for order, for invisibility. And now they were using that invisibility to erase what happened to my son. A woman watering her hanging plant saw me and immediately looked away. I slowed my pace when I reached the bench by the artificial duck pond. 2 teens were whispering at the far end, eyes flicking toward me and then down at their phones. I'd seen that look before, recognition, but no intention of involvement. They knew who I was. They'd read the community bulletin Clarissa had sent out. Incident involving minor disturbance between 2 teenagers under investigation. It didn't say Nico's name, but it didn't have to. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the thread I'd archived 3 days ago. Anonymous comments, residents murmuring about a kid who overreacted, a father pushing too hard, a family with a history of trouble, subtle poison, words soaked in HOA-approved phrasing, just enough doubt to make silence feel safer than truth. Clarissa's reach ran deeper than most realized. It wasn't just board policies or citations. She curated narratives. She shaped perception. I reached the community garden and pretended to examine the rosemary beds. An older man knelt a few feet away, planting spring bulbs. His hat dipped low over his face, but I recognized the posture. "Mr. Neal," I said quietly. He didn't look up. "Afternoon? Did you see anything that day?" The trowel paused. He tapped it twice on the edge of the planter, brushed soil from his hands. "I was upstairs," he said after a pause. "Window open, saw the aftermath. I wasn't close enough to say what started it. Neither were the people Clarissa used to file the violation." He stood slowly, knees popping. "This isn't the venue for that." "Maybe not. But the people getting hurt don't get to choose the venue, do they?" He turned then. Grayson Neal, retired judge, arbitration panel member, technically impartial, in reality bound by HOA loyalty and years of quiet complicity. But I saw something flicker across his face, a flicker of doubt, or guilt, maybe both. "Be careful how far you push," he said. "Some people here, they're not interested in what's right, only what's stable." I didn't answer. He picked up his tools and walked toward the eastern exit gate, his shoulders stiff. He hadn't denied seeing what happened. He hadn't defended her either. That was something. I walked back the long way, circling past the community pool. The common area Nico was now banned from under a temporary behavioral review. A laminated notice on the pool gate listed new rules. No loitering, no unaccompanied minors, no sketchbooks or notebooks allowed within 50 feet of the fence perimeter. Sketchbooks. They'd written it in. Policy tailored to justify the punishment after the fact. I snapped a picture of the sign. Back home, I found Nico in his room, curled beneath his weighted blanket. The sketchpad sat untouched on his desk. He hadn't drawn a line since the attack. He didn't look up when I stepped in. I sat at his desk and flipped to the last page in the pad. The sketch wasn't finished, but I saw it now. The edge of the tile mosaic, the red swirls his mother had etched into the design. He'd been drawing her work. Without knowing it, he'd sat in the same spot she stood 10 years ago and tried to bring her back with pencil strokes. And that's where they hit him. They didn't just swing at my son. They hit memory. They hit legacy. They hit the only place in this sterilized suburb that still had our fingerprints on it. I stared at the unfinished sketch until my jaw ached from how tight I was holding it. They think this is over. They think the noise will die down. But it won't. Not until every parent in this place knows what Clarissa Pendle is hiding behind that smile. The mail kiosk sat at the edge of Highmere Crest like an afterthought. A concrete island surrounded by trimmed hedges and security cameras that never seemed to catch the right moments. It was the one place everyone passed through eventually. You couldn't avoid it without making a statement. That's why I went there. Grayson Neal was already inside when I arrived, standing rigid in front of box 214, envelope half pulled, as if he'd forgotten why he'd come. The air smelled faintly of paper dust and hot metal. His reflection in the scratched stainless steel panel looked older than I remembered, jaw clenched, eyes tired. He didn't greet me. He didn't have to. We both knew why this moment mattered. "Elian," he said finally, not turning. His voice carried the weight of a man used to courtrooms, not confessions. "I was hoping not to run into you today." "I figured," I said, stopping a few feet away. "That usually means I should." He exhaled slowly, slid the envelope back into the box, and closed the door with deliberate care. The click echoed louder than it should have. He adjusted his glasses, buying time. "You need to understand my position," he said. "I sit on the arbitration panel. I'm required to remain neutral." "Neutral doesn't mean blind." His shoulders tightened. He turned then, really looked at me. I saw it clearly now, the conflict etched into the lines around his eyes. This wasn't about loyalty to Clarissa. This was about fear of consequence, of destabilizing a system he'd helped uphold for years. "I didn't see the beginning," he said carefully, "only what came after. That's not what you said in the garden. He flinched just barely. A judge's reflex, words measured, weighed, edited before release. I saw your son on the ground, he continued. I saw Joran standing over him. I saw people watching from their balconies and doing nothing. And I saw Clarissa arrive less than 3 minutes later, he said, quieter now, before security, before anyone else. There it was, the crack. A woman brushed past us, collecting her mail, pretending not to hear. Grayson waited until she left, before speaking again. She told everyone to step back, he said. Told them it was handled, that there was no need to make a scene. And you believed her. I believed the system would correct itself, he said. That's what systems are supposed to do. I nodded slowly. And when they don't? His gaze dropped to the floor. For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the overhead light. I've spent my life enforcing rules, he said, believing procedure protects people, but procedure also protects power, sometimes more effectively. I said nothing. Silence was doing more work than I ever could. I was on my balcony that afternoon, he went on, voice tight. I had my phone in my hand. I told myself I was just watching, that it wasn't my place. My chest burned. While my son lay there, he winced. Yes. The word landed between us, heavy and final. I've replayed it every night since, he said. The angle, the distance, the way Joran didn't hesitate. That wasn't a stumble. It wasn't roughhousing. It was targeted. That's what I told them. And they dismissed you, he said. Not a question. Officially, I said. They find my son instead. His hands curled into fists at his sides. For the first time, anger surfaced. Real, unfiltered. Not at me, at himself. I should have spoken up. Immediately, he said. But Clarissa, she knows how to isolate dissent. I've seen her do it to others, quietly, efficiently. So you stayed quiet, yes? I stepped closer. Staying quiet is still a choice, Grayson. He met my eyes. Something shifted there. Resolve, maybe, or resignation. I know, he said, and that choice is costing me more than I expected. The door at the far end opened. Another resident entered. The moment fractured. Grayson straightened, slipped the mask back on. I can't help you publicly, he said under his breath. Not yet. Yet, I repeated. He hesitated, then nodded once. Yet. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. Elian. I stopped. You're right, he said. This isn't over, and Clarissa Pendel is counting on everyone believing it is. I walked out into the afternoon sun, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. Grayson Neal had seen the truth, and eventually it would eat him alive if he didn't let it out. The notice came 3 days later. A folded white envelope tucked under my front door, not mailed, not stamped, delivered by hand. Inside was a printed violation labeled Final Warning, Category C Infraction. I unfolded it at the kitchen counter, hands still damp from rinsing Nico's cereal bowl. Subject, Nicholas Carr, resident dependent. Violation, behavioral misconduct, community disturbance action. Provisional suspension of access to shared facilities. Pending evaluation. I read it twice, then again. They were escalating. Not just a ban from the pool now, but from the entire complex. Nico couldn't walk to the park, couldn't visit the library alcove, couldn't ride his bike on the perimeter trail, all pending a formal assessment by a third-party mediator assigned by the HOA board. They wanted to control his movement. There was more. Addendum. Secondary parental accountability review. Initiated violation. Escalatory conduct. Threats to board. Harmony. Action strike 1 of 3, strike. Like I was some unruly tenant in a dorm. I set the paper down beside Nico's sketchbook and stared at both. The lines on the page, the loops and arcs of his unfinished drawing, they looked like veins to me. Fragile. Tangled. Alive. The HOA wasn't trying to discipline us. They were trying to shut us down. I drove to the board office without calling first. It was late enough in the day that the administrative manager would be alone. Margot Denley. I'd met her once at a spring cleanup meeting, brisk, sharp-eyed, efficient. not particularly loyal to anyone except the rules as written. She looked up when I walked in, lips pressed into a line. "I assume this is about the notice," she said. "You assume correctly." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. I didn't sit. "I need access to the documentation behind this," I said. "The incident reports, the review logs, Clarissa's basis for the strike." "You'll need to file a formal disclosure request," she replied. "It takes 7 to 10 business days." "Margot, you know I have the right to see it." She hesitated. "I can show you the incident record. That's it." She turned her monitor slightly, tapped a few keys, and pointed to a line item. Date: logged April 7th. Observer statement redacted. The boy appeared agitated, possibly unstable. Hostile posture near community mural. There was a photo attached. Nico sitting on the bench, alone, sketchbook open. "I want to know who submitted that," I said. "It's anonymous," she said. "Clarissa allows certain reports to be filed under confidentiality protocols." "Of course she does." "That's not a real behavioral incident," I said. "That's profiling." Margot didn't argue. She just looked tired. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carr," she said. "I've worked here 10 years. I've never seen a dependent fully banned from common spaces. But I've also never seen a board president move this fast." I met her eyes. "Why do you think that is?" Margot looked away. She didn't answer. I left the office and stood outside, the Florida heat pressing against my back like a weight. The east parking lot shimmered at the edge of the view. Past that, just barely visible through the hedges, the mosaic wall, still untouched, still stained with silence. My phone buzzed. A notification from the Highmere Crest Community app. Reminder: April HOA board meeting agenda, closed door session. Added, they were preparing something. I texted Grayson, "They've initiated a strike, pushing me into escalation." He replied 10 minutes later, "She's cornering you, but she's overreaching." Another message followed seconds later. "You're not the only one with something to show." I stared at that line for a long time. Back home, I found Nico sitting by the living room window, sketchbook in his lap again. No pencil. Just holding it. His fingers traced the edge like it was a wound. "They banned you from the park," I said gently. "But we're going to fight it." He didn't look up. I sat beside him. "They're scared of you, you know," I said. "Because you see things clearly, because you don't pretend." He blinked slowly. I reached into my bag and pulled out a printed copy of the redacted report. "They said you looked unstable," I added, "because you were drawing." He finally met my eyes. Just for a moment, that was enough. Because I knew what came next. Clarissa Pendell thought she'd buried the truth beneath policy. But I was about to show her what a real report looks like. The trauma wing echoed with low footsteps and clipped voices as I walked the corridor toward the imaging lab. It smelled like antiseptic and warm plastic. I knew the scent too well. I'd spent the better part of my professional life inside hospitals, drawing the aftermath of injuries no courtroom could unsee. But this time, it wasn't a stranger's injury I was here to illustrate. It was my son's. The radiology tech on duty didn't ask why I was there. My name still carried enough weight from past cases. I signed the access form, stepped into the scan room, and pulled Nico's chart up on the terminal. He hadn't needed sedation, just silence and time. The CT slices were clean, no internal bleeding, but the clavicle was fractured. The bruising near the scapula wasn't from a fall. It was compression, not impact. I copied the scan files to my drive, opened my tablet, and began the overlays. My hand moved without hesitation. Measurement lines, trajectory arcs, force simulations. I didn't need to guess. I'd built diagrams like this for cases involving gang assaults, police brutality, abusive caregivers. Now, I was building one for a child who sat quietly in a parking lot, sketching a wall his mother once painted. Joran's blow had landed diagonally across Nico's shoulder. The angle required height and leverage, not a stumble, not a scuffle. It had to be intentional. It had to be downward. The vector didn't lie. I layered the annotations in red. Each line told the same story. A strike from above, driven with enough force to drop a boy to the pavement. The skin-level bruise had faded already, but the pattern was there in the bones. They'd tried to call this a misunderstanding, a behavioral issue, an unstable teen causing problems. But the evidence disagreed. When I finished, I rendered the frame sequence into a courtroom-style board, panel by panel, like a silent film. Fracture, compression, lack of bracing response, trauma window under 3 seconds. I stepped back from the screen. My pulse had slowed. The noise in my head, white hot ever since the HOA's second violation notice, finally dulled to something I could name: clarity. I emailed a copy to my secure server, encrypted and time-stamped. On the way out, I passed the nurse's station. A young man in scrubs glanced up and paused. "Dr. Carr?" he asked. I hadn't used that title in years, but I nodded. "You drew the diagrams for the Batista head trauma case last month, right?" "I did. They used it in training. No one forgets the way you framed the spine fracture through motion blur." "Appreciate that." He hesitated. "Sorry, it's kind of an honor." I gave a polite smile and left. Outside, the heat hit me like a slap. I stood there for a moment, blinking into the sun, before unlocking my car and setting the tablet on the passenger seat. The hospital loomed behind me, a place I'd once considered neutral ground. Now it felt like my only ally. Clarissa Pendle could manipulate security footage. She could rewrite witness statements. She could publish violations with selective language. But bones didn't lie. Trajectories didn't lie. Smartwatch logs didn't lie. Back at home, Nico was in the backyard, sitting under the small awning where his mother used to keep her gardening bench. He looked up when I stepped outside, and I could tell he sensed it, something in my expression. Or maybe he just knew me too well. I knelt beside him and handed him a new mechanical pencil. Not the same brand as his old one. He'd thrown that one away. "This one's sharper," I said. "Cleaner lines." He turned it in his fingers, then nodded once. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. Upstairs, I printed the annotated diagrams and sealed them in a folder. Not for the HOA, not yet. For the insurance carrier, for the city's ethics committee, for the board meeting Clarissa thought would be closed off and quiet. She didn't know I'd already prepared the evidence. She didn't know that her son's fist had given me more than pain to grieve. It had given me the proof she couldn't spin. The sun was dropping fast when I reached the edge of the east parking lot. Long shadows stretched from the rows of townhouses, splitting the pavement into light and dark bands. I parked just far enough from the mosaic wall to see it clearly through the hedges. Nico's sketch was still in my back pocket, creased now from being folded too long. I pulled it out and unfolded the page, smoothing it against the dashboard. The lines weren't perfect, but I knew them. The swirls, the arch, the cracked tile in the upper left corner. He'd drawn the exact outline of the mosaic his mother made before she died. And he'd done it from memory. He didn't even know he was sitting in the same spot she had once stood. That's where it hit me. This wasn't just the site of an assault. It was a place tethered to something deeper. Her legacy, his connection to her, and everything the HOA had tried to sterilize in the name of uniformity. And Clarissa Pendle had turned that spot into a violation zone. I stepped out of the car and crossed the lot, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The mosaic shimmered in the fading light. Terracotta, ocean blue, rust red. A swirl of colors mostly hidden now by a trash bin and a new "no loitering" sign hammered directly into the brick wall. They were trying to erase her. I crouched and found the tile I remembered, small, near the base, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. Her initials carved lightly into the glaze. AK almost faded, but still there. I pressed my hand to the stone and closed my eyes. "You built something beautiful," I whispered. "They won't bury it." Behind me, a car door slammed. I stood quickly. A woman I barely recognized approached, short, wiry, older. Mrs. Delaney, I thought, lived 2 units down from the pool. She slowed when she saw me near the wall. "Evening," she said warily. "Evening." She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the sign, then the mosaic. "It's a shame what happened to your boy." My chest tightened. "You saw it?" "No," she said softly. But I saw Joran 2 hours later, hands bruised, smug as he's anything. Clarissa had her arm around him, looked like she was celebrating. I swallowed. "You didn't say anything." Her mouth pulled tight. "I've lived here 12 years. I've seen what happens when people speak up. Petty citations, noise complaints, lawn violations. And you think staying quiet keeps you safe?" She looked away. "I think it keeps things simple." I nodded once. "Maybe it used to, not anymore." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned and walked back toward my car. At home, I laid out the folder with Nico's medical images, the injury overlays, and the sketch. Then I added one more thing, a photo of the mosaic tile, his mother's initials, time-stamped, geotagged. The next day I filed a notice of inquiry with the state HOA regulatory board. Clarissa's behavior met multiple criteria for misuse of authority: retaliatory fines, policy overreach, and selective policy enforcement. I included the documentation, the images, and my analysis report. Then I sent a letter to the HOA's liability insurer. I attached the full diagnostic workup, expert annotations, and outlined the risk of an ADA-based negligence claim. Nico's diagnosis wasn't just a detail. It was a legal layer the HOA had completely ignored. I didn't wait for their reply. This wasn't about back-and-forth email chains. This was about creating pressure where it counted, through systems Clarissa couldn't manipulate. That evening, Nico sat beside me on the porch. He'd begun drawing again, slower this time. Pencil in one hand, the new mechanical one I'd given him. He glanced up, squinting against the light. "They're going to take the wall down, aren't they?" "No," I said. "They're going to try. But I'm not going to let them." He nodded once, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something behind his eyes that hadn't been there since the assault. Trust, not in the system, in me. And I knew what I had to do next. I wasn't just building a case anymore. I was building a reckoning. The knock came just after 9. I was still at the dining table, reviewing the language of the complaint I drafted to the state board when I heard it. 3 sharp raps. Not the kind that came from a neighbor dropping by. The kind that carried weight. I opened the door expecting confrontation. But it was Grayson Neal. He wasn't in his usual pressed polo and slacks. Just a windbreaker, dark jeans, eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. He held something under his arm, a small, hard-shell drive case. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "But you are." He hesitated on the step. "I need to talk to you, but not out here." I stepped aside. He entered slowly, glancing around like the house itself might disapprove. When we reached the kitchen, he placed the drive case on the table, like it weighed more than it should. "You remember what I said at the kiosk," he began, "about seeing the aftermath?" "I remember, every word." "I lied," he said. I said nothing, just let him stand in it. "I didn't just see the aftermath," he continued. "I recorded the whole thing. I was on a call with my brother. I saw Joran come around the corner, saw him shove your son. The sketch pad hit the pavement before Nico did." He opened the case and removed a flash drive, placing it between us. "I downloaded it that same night. Clarissa doesn't know I have it." My fingers stayed still. "Why now?" "Because watching her twist the narrative into policy, watching her paint your son as the threat, it's more than I can stomach. But more than that," he looked up, face tight. "I can't look at myself anymore if I let this go." He slid the drive toward me. "It's a full minute and a half, audio and video. You'll hear Joran taunting him. You'll see the moment he hits him." My heart didn't race. It slowed, settled into something heavy and cold. "What do you want me to do with it?" I asked. "I don't care anymore," Grayson said. "Use it. Burn the whole damn HOA down if you have to. Just make sure she doesn't get to rewrite this again." He turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I don't think Nico fell. I think he got back up." After he left, I stood in the quiet for a long time. The house hummed around me, steady and still. Upstairs, Nico's lamp was still on. I heard the soft scratch of pencil against paper. He was drawing again. I plugged the drive into my laptop. The file was clean, no compression artifacts, no glitches. Grayson had used a high-resolution home security cam, the kind he probably told himself was just for liability coverage, never expecting it to carry a moral weight. And there it was. Joran Pendle, tall, smirking, approaching from the right. Nico sitting on the bench, sketchpad in his lap. No words from him, just stillness. Then the shove, hard. Nico hit the pavement shoulder first, sketchpad skittering across the sidewalk. Joran loomed over him. "You gonna cry now, freak?" he said. Then the punch, a second, a third, and then silence, as Joran looked around. scanning the nearby windows like he knew someone might have seen, but also knew no one would speak. The file ended with Nico curled inward, arms over his chest. Still. I leaned back from the screen and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just testimony. This was irrefutable. Not a theory, not a diagram, not a violation to debate in a closed session. This was a recording. A witness who couldn't be intimidated. A truth that couldn't be redacted. I backed up the file to 3 locations. Then I burned a copy to a physical disk. No cloud, no chain of custody gaps, just hard data. They'd taken away Nico's right to sit near his mother's mosaic. They'd called it a safety risk. But I had the footage that proved the only threat in Highmere Crest was the boy they protected, and the president who covered for him. And now the clock had started ticking. I didn't sleep that night. I laid the drive, the printed injury diagrams, and the signed hospital report across the dining table like a war map. Every document was backed by time-stamped data. Every annotation linked to a source. The recording Grayson had given me, labeled, encrypted, time-indexed, no conjecture, no gaps, no he said, she said. It wasn't just proof, it was structure, built to hold up under pressure, and pressure was coming. By sunrise, I had drafted 3 separate packets. The first was for the HOA's liability insurer, outlining gross misconduct, retaliation against a minor with a documented disability, and suppression of key video evidence. The second went to the state HOA regulatory board, citing specific statute violations, misuse of authority, retaliatory enforcement, concealment of incident data, and possible collusion among board members. But the third was the one that mattered most. It was addressed to every single household in Highmere Crest. I knew how Clarissa operated. She controlled the narrative before questions could form. Her strength was speed. She'd frame concern as disruption, dissent as instability. But her weakness? She believed silence meant agreement, that the quiet ones would always stay quiet. That was about to change. I designed the packet like I'd design an evidence board, chronological, visual, undeniable. I included a QR code to a private link, where the video Grayson had given me would speak for itself. No commentary, just the truth, as it unfolded in 108 seconds. I made 42 copies. Then I picked up the phone. Matt? Elian? You still do print runs? Matt Larkson, former client, local graphic designer. I'd helped him with a spine injury claim years ago. He owed me. I cashed it in. Drop the files, he said. You'll have them by 5. By noon, I was at my studio, taping together the last mock-up of the community visual. A wall-size breakdown of Nico's injury sequence with heat map overlays from the CT scan. I used courtroom-style framing, red for impact points, yellow for force trajectory, blue for displacement. Nothing sensational, just facts. Around 4, the doorbell rang. Matt stood there with a box full of sealed envelopes. They're sharp, he said, and quiet, no branding, just the truth. I nodded, pulled out an envelope, and slid it open. It was perfect, minimalist, clean, lethal. That night, I walked the neighborhood under cover of dusk. Porch lights flicked on as I passed. A few curtains moved. I didn't care. I dropped 1 envelope at each doorstep, tucking it behind the mailbox flap or under doormats. No confrontation, no speeches, just paper. By the time I reached my own porch, the last envelope was gone. Inside, Nico was sitting cross-legged on the floor, piecing together a new drawing with bits of torn sketches. His eyes met mine. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just handed me a small square, his mother's initials, drawn again in the bottom right corner. I taped it to the corner of the living room window, right above the sill. You ready? I asked him. He nodded once. The next morning, the HOA's internal message board was in chaos. 1 post, then 4, then 17. Why weren't we told about the video? Is this real? I want to vote. By noon, the thread was locked, but the damage was done. Clarissa's grip wasn't broken yet, but the pressure had shifted. Her authority no longer moved unopposed. At 3:47 p.m., I received an email from the HOA secretary. Subject line, request for meeting, evidence review. Body. The board requests your presence at a closed session to discuss the matter raised by recent circulation. Attendance optional, but strongly advised. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to the insurer instead. Then I added a note. You should be aware they are now attempting to handle this privately. I will not be attending any session where my son is not officially cleared and restored. I recommend you prepare your legal division accordingly. The real preparation had already been done. The evidence was out. The story was no longer theirs to control. Now I just had to wait for the pressure to hit the right nerve. I spent the next 2 days tightening every seam, every timestamp, every chain of custody entry. Every pixel of the video file was triple-checked. I knew Clarissa would look for a crack, any crack, a misaligned metadata stamp, an unverifiable signature, 1 pixel out of sync, and she'd try to spin it into doubt. So I gave her nothing to work with. The drive was cloned onto 2 more physical copies, stored separately. One went into a fireproof lockbox in my studio. One into the care of an attorney I trusted in the next county over. Someone with no stake in Highmere Crest, no connections to Clarissa, and no interest in HOA politics. But the final prep wasn't technical. It was psychological. I started calling residents. Not all of them, just the ones I knew hadn't posted in the thread, the ones who had seen the envelope but hadn't said a word. People who'd looked away when Nico passed by in the weeks after the assault. They weren't cruel, just scared. The first few calls were short, polite discomfort, apologies without shape, but the 4th call changed everything. Miriam Keys, widow, retired art teacher, lived on Birch Path. She didn't even let me finish my first sentence. I saw it happen, she said. My stomach went still. You were there? I was on my balcony. I saw the boy strike your son. I saw him fall, and I saw Clarissa arrive 5 minutes later and send the other witnesses back inside. Why didn't you come forward? I did, she said, voice suddenly bitter. I sent a message through the community report form, a full account. You know what came back? No? A lawn care. Violation, she said. Claimed I had unauthorized plantings on the side path. I've had the same rose bushes for 12 years. I exhaled. Would you be willing to say any of that publicly? I already did once, she said. But yes, I'll say it again. You tell me where and when. By evening, I had 3 more neighbors echoing her story. They didn't know about each other, but they all remembered Clarissa showing up within minutes and telling them not to spread confusion. None of them wanted to speak at a formal meeting, but they gave me written statements, each signed and dated. The web was starting to come apart. Clarissa had moved too quickly. She'd been so sure of her control, she didn't think anyone would connect the retaliation. But people had been watching, and some of them had quietly documented everything. That night, I met Grayson in the parking lot. He leaned against his car, arms crossed, eyes wary. You've got momentum, he said. I've got witnesses, I replied. And you? He sighed. I've sat on that panel for 7 years. Never once thought I'd be the dissenting voice. You won't be alone. I handed him a copy of the compiled evidence packet, the injury overlays, the video transcript, the witness statements, the QR archive link, everything indexed and bound. You present this, I said, or I will. Either way, it gets shown. He didn't speak for a while. Then he looked up at the second-floor balcony across the lot. That's where I stood, he said, the day it happened. I know. He took the folder. I'll speak, he said quietly. But not for you, for him. He meant Nico. Good, I said. Because it's his wall they're trying to bury. Grayson's knuckles whitened around the folder. Not anymore. The wind picked up, rustling the hedges along the eastern walkway. The mosaic caught the porch light from someone's entryway, glowing in fractured tiles, imperfect, visible. When I got home, Nico was at the kitchen table, coloring in a new draft of the design. His lines were stronger, bolder. He'd added initials to the bottom corner again. Not just AK. Now it read AKNNK. I didn't say anything. I just sat beside him and started sealing envelopes for the final round of distribution. By the time I looked up, he'd drawn a new shape at the top of the wall, a fist, midair, disintegrating into birds. The HOA pavilion was already half full by the time I arrived. Plastic chairs lined the covered space in tight rows, most of them occupied by familiar faces pretending not to know one another. The overhead fan spun uselessly in the humidity. A pitcher of lemonade sat untouched on the folding table near the back. No one drank at these meetings anymore. Clarissa Pendle stood at the front, calm and poised, in a deep blue blouse that matched the HOA banner behind her. Her voice carried without needing a microphone. As previously stated, tonight's meeting will begin with an executive board review, followed by limited community comment. She made it sound routine, forgettable, like this wasn't the night her authority would be put on trial. I stepped in from the side entrance and caught Grayson Neal's eye across the front row. He gave a small nod, then looked down at the folder in his lap, the same one I'd handed him in the parking lot. His grip hadn't loosened since. The board members looked uneasy. James Trent, the treasurer, kept glancing toward the growing cluster of residents at the back. Even Martha Bell, the compliance chair and one of Clarissa's most loyal allies, tapped her pen like she was bracing for something. Clarissa pressed on. We've received reports of misinformation circulating throughout the community, unauthorized materials, edited footage, and documents taken out of context. A murmur rippled across the crowd. I stayed silent. So did Grayson. I want to assure everyone that the board has taken appropriate action based on the information available at the time of the incident. Decisions were made in the interest of safety, fairness, and maintaining order. She looked directly at me then, and we encourage those spreading confusion to refrain from further division. There it was, her final attempt to reassert control, framed as unity, delivered as veiled threat. She turned to the table behind her and pulled out a stack of printed statements. We will now proceed with internal review, board only, after which we may open to brief public comment. Grayson stood. The room stilled. Even Clarissa faltered. I'd like to speak before that, he said, voice steady. I won't take long. Mr. Neal, Clarissa said slowly, you know that board members are permitted to... I'm not here as a board member, he said. I'm here as a witness. Silence. Clarissa's jaw tightened. Grayson, I must insist... He opened the folder and laid the first page on the podium. On April 3rd, I personally witnessed Joran Pendle assault Nicholas Carr near the mosaic wall. I recorded the incident in full, without edits, from my home security system. I have since provided that footage to the appropriate parties. Clarissa's face paled. The other board members froze. Grayson continued. I remained silent out of fear of retaliation, fear of damaging relationships. But after reviewing the board's response, issuing violations against the victim, banning a child with a diagnosed learning disability from public areas, I realized silence was complicity. He lifted his eyes. That video has now been viewed by dozens of residents, accompanied by medical analysis, time-synced metadata, and corroborating witness statements. I reviewed them myself. I verified the timestamps. I reviewed the injury diagram overlays. He turned toward the audience. And everything you've heard from the Gitsich board until now was a lie. Gasps. Some covered their mouths. Others leaned forward. Clarissa didn't speak. Her eyes darted toward Martha, who avoided the gaze. Grayson stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat without looking at her. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The silence said more than I ever could. One by one, residents began murmuring, then rising. Some spoke softly to one another. Some turned and walked toward the exit with quiet disgust. The illusion had cracked. James Trent, still seated, looked at Clarissa and cleared his throat. We'll need to pause the meeting. Clarissa opened her mouth to object, but nothing came out. The power had shifted, and it wasn't coming back. Clarissa never regained control of the room. The moment Grayson sat down, the board's unity unraveled. Martha stood without being asked, her papers shaking in her hands. She turned toward the crowd, but not to speak. She walked out. No eye contact, no defense, just silence and retreat. James Trent followed minutes later. Face flushed, murmuring something about not having full context, whatever that meant. Clarissa remained frozen behind the podium, one hand gripping its edge like it might steady the collapse. But she couldn't stop it, not this time. Someone from the back shouted, "Where's the apology?" Another added, "We trusted you." And then came the third voice, sharp and clear, Miriam Keyes. "I filed a witness statement the day it happened," she said, rising from her seat. "I described the attack. I described your son's behavior. And you silence me with a bogus fine and a threat to report me for garden code violations. Clarissa's eyes flicked toward her. Ms. Keyes, this isn't— I'm not done, Miriam snapped. You made me feel like I imagined what I saw, like I was the one crossing a line. And now I find out I wasn't the only one you silenced? A rumble of agreement swept the room. Clarissa opened her mouth again, but Grayson spoke before she could regain footing. I move to suspend President Pendle's authority pending a full ethics review. The room fell quiet. I second it, said a younger board member, Jared Kane, the newest appointee. His voice was quiet, but the damage was done. You don't have that authority, Clarissa said, her tone cracking. You can't just— The bylaws permit a temporary suspension with 2 board votes and a majority community agreement at an open meeting, Grayson replied. You wrote that clause yourself, remember? Clarissa's face drained of color. I call for a show of hands, Grayson said, turning to the residents. All those in favor of the motion to suspend Clarissa Pendle's position as president of the board until an outside investigation is complete, raise your hand. At first, a few hands lifted, then more, then nearly the entire room. I didn't raise mine. I didn't have to. She looked around the pavilion and saw what I saw, an HOA president surrounded by neighbors no longer willing to carry her silence. Clarissa stepped back from the podium. This isn't over, she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. I'll file an injunction. You can, Grayson said calmly, but you'll do it as a suspended board member, not from this podium. The final blow wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was the printer in the back of the room, spitting out new sign-up sheets for a board restructuring vote. Clarissa turned and walked out the side, head high, but spine bent. Nobody clapped. Nobody chased her. When she disappeared into the parking lot, the entire pavilion seemed to exhale. I stepped up to the front slowly, not to gloat, but to ground the moment. My son was 13 when my wife died, I said quietly. She left behind a mosaic on that wall outside, and the only way he knew how to connect to her again was through that sketch pad. I looked at the crowd. Your board tried to frame that as a threat. You saw the truth for yourselves. The question now isn't what happens to Clarissa. It's what kind of neighborhood you want to live in from here on out. No one spoke, but many nodded, and that was enough. I gathered my folder, gave a final nod to Grayson, and walked out under the night sky. The air was still thick, but lighter now, like something had been let go. I passed the mosaic on the way home. The new security light caught the edge of it, colors deepened by shadow. Someone had left a single daffodil at the base. Not mine. Someone else remembered her. When I got home, Nico was asleep on the couch, sketchpad resting on his chest. The corner tile he'd drawn earlier now had something new beneath the initials. She saw what they missed. He never said who she was, but I knew. The morning after Clarissa's suspension felt different before I even opened my eyes. The house was quiet, but not the hollow, heavy quiet we'd been living in. This one hummed, like the air itself was trying to tell me something had shifted. When I stepped outside, the dew on the walkway glimmered against the mosaic wall in the distance. Even from here, I could see it more clearly than I had in months. Maybe clarity was contagious. By noon, the neighborhood gathered around the pavilion again. Not out of obligation this time, out of choice. Parents pushed strollers toward the tables. Teens lingered by the hedges. People who used to avoid eye contact with me were waving from across the path. And though Clarissa hadn't shown her face since last night, the board's restructuring vote was already underway, handled by a neutral moderator from the HOA Oversight Office. This time, everything was documented, transparent, public. Exactly what she feared most. I stayed on the sidelines with Nico beside me, his sketch pad tucked under his arm. His shoulders weren't hunched. He wasn't scanning the ground. He was watching the crowd like he finally believed himself allowed to exist inside it. They're voting now, he said softly. I know. He held his sketch pad tighter, then let out a breath. Do you think they'll tear down the wall? They won't, I said. Not anymore. The vote ended with a ripple of applause. A new interim board was announced, people who had never raised their hands before, but did now because silence finally had a cost. Among them was Miriam Keyes, standing straight-backed with a folder in one hand. She nodded at me, and I nodded back. Grayson stood beside her, not as a judge or board member this time, but as someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. The relief in his posture was unmistakable. A few moments later, the moderator called everyone's attention. In recognition of recent events, he said, and in acknowledgement of past failures, the community has requested a formal restoration project for the mosaic wall. The motion has passed with overwhelming majority. Nico's fingers froze on his sketch pad. Then he opened it, turned it toward me, and pointed to his latest drawing. The mosaic, but completed. His mother's design blended with his own additions, including the fractured birds rising into the sky. "You did this," he murmured. "No," I said. "You did." Residents gathered near the wall, forming a semicircle as the restoration plan was announced. A few volunteers brought out brushes, cloths, and sealant, ready to begin the first cleaning pass. Before anyone touched the tiles, the moderator cleared his throat. "We'd like to invite the Carr family to place the first stroke." The crowd parted. Nico looked up at me. I nodded. He stepped forward slowly, trembling just a little, and the entire community watched as he dipped a cloth into clean water and pressed it gently against the lowest tile, his mother's tile. The glaze brightened instantly, colors blooming back to life like something waking from a long sleep. A few neighbors clapped softly, others bowed their heads, and then, one by one, they joined him. Not to erase the past, but to honor it, to protect it. For the first time since the assault, I felt the tight coil in my chest loosen. Later, as people drifted away, the moderator approached me with a thick envelope. "For your records," he said, "the state has acknowledged your complaint. They're opening an official inquiry into the previous administration's conduct." I accepted it with a simple thank you. But the real closure came when I turned back toward the mosaic. A new plaque had been installed at its base, temporary but already polished, in honor of AK, whose art made this place home, and for NK, who reminded us of its worth. I swallowed hard. Nico stood beside me, brushing paint dust from his fingers. "You ready to go home?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "I want to stay a little longer." So we did. The sky was turning gold by the time we finally left, walking side by side past neighbors who no longer looked through us, past the pavilion where power had broken open the night before, past the gate that now felt a little less like a barrier and a little more like a threshold. As we reached our street, Nico tugged my sleeve. "Dad? Yeah? I'm glad you didn't stay quiet." I nodded, throat tight. "Me too. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with us. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. We're just getting started. And tell me in the comments, whose silence should we break next?